We're looking at Nathaniel Hawthorne, the author of numerous tales in the 1830s and 1840s, 4 book-length romances, and the creator of Hester Prynne, probably the most famous female character in American literature. A woman born into 17th century Boston of the Puritans, but seemingly with a vision of something higher than the Puritans could offer. Something different, something higher, more encompassing, a vision of freedom perhaps, incomprehensible to her peers. And in presenting Hester and her working out of her destiny in this Puritan community, Nathaniel Hawthorne seems to be saying something about Puritanism in general. The work turns out to be a kind of indictment of the whole Puritan system. And Hester Prynne turns out to be not really a 17th century woman at all, but perhaps a woman more from Nathaniel Hawthorne's own period in the 19th century. And finally, in his introduction to the Scarlet Letter, called The Custom House, Hawthorne provides for us the way in which he created the Scarlet Letter, the genesis of the book. And in so doing, he provides perhaps one of the best descriptions we have in literature of the creative process itself. And along the way, he defines in a classic sort of a way what the romance in America was all about. Welcome to English 3350, a survey of American literature before the Civil War. We're in Studio 3 at the M.D. Anderson Library on the main campus of the University of Houston. I'm Barry Wood, and today we're looking at the Scarlet Letter in the third of our classes on Nathaniel Hawthorne, perhaps the central writer of romances in this period just before the American Civil War. The backdrop for this book is Puritan New England. We've established that the date for the dating for the book, as far as the setting is concerned, is probably 1642 to 1649. The location is Boston, the principal city of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. If we keep in mind that Massachusetts Bay was founded in 1630, then we get a perspective on this story. It's really beginning just 12 years into the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and it takes place really at the height of Puritan influence and power. We do not yet see any signs at that time of the Puritan decline. That's the sort of thing that came later in the 1660s with the Halfway Covenant, and still later in the 1690s with the witchcraft trials. The Boston Puritans, as they're presented in this work, have a peculiar kind of religion which not only fits in with Calvinism, but is also severely restricted to just parts of the Calvinist religion. Hawthorne narrows the focus in Scarlet Letter. He focuses principally on crime and punishment. And this brings out 2 particular aspects of Puritanism in this book: the doctrine of total depravity and the very powerful emphasis on law, patriarchal rulership, and community order and how it is maintained. Hawthorne's genius in this book is that he unfolds virtually every nuance of crime and punishment, and especially the nuances that have to do with psychology, the psychology of guilt and the psychology of punishment, showing that these two were certainly a part of the New England Puritan religion. The focus of this religion, as I say, is a narrow one. There's little evidence in the novel that these Puritans ever focused on Christ, the Christ of the New Testament, or for that matter, on God, or on any symbol thereof. We don't see, for instance, much in the way of altars or crosses. There is no scene inside any church in the novel. And, of course, the church is the central institution of this religion. Even Dimsdale's sermons are heard from the street. The Puritan focus seems to be on other things, on the wood, the stone, the oaken doors of the prison, and on this dramatic opening scene of Scarlet wearing a scarlet A on her dress, signifying adultery. The religious symbols, if we could call them religious at all in this book, appear to be the scaffold and the prison, emblems of sin and guilt, signifying the condition, of course, of all Puritans, totally depraved sinners. God, to the extent that he stands behind this book, is a transcendent God whose dealings with man have little to do with love or forgiveness or mercy. He's a God who deals with man as a lawgiver, as a judge, and as an executioner. Hester is not asked to pray for mercy, to seek divine mercy. She is told to suffer her punishment, to repent her sin, and to name her sinner. Their view of man is, as I say, strictly in terms of total depravity. They see only an abstract adulteress in front of them. Hawthorne notes the inability of these men in the opening scenes of the book to disentangle the mesh of good and evil. And he adds that they really had no more right to meddle with the question of human guilt or passion and anguish. And in one interesting comment, he says that Puritan society accomplished so much precisely because it imagined and hoped so little. Another aspect that seems to come out of this book connected with Puritanism is the suppression of individuality that is captured in the book often in terms of wildness or primitivism. The Puritan religion here, of course, is a response to an extreme position in history, with civilization behind in Europe and these people now planted on a wilderness shore between a wild sea and a wild forest. Of course, their position is an extreme one, and their response is to suppress wildness, to deny the passions, to legislate against feeling, and to exalt law and order and control. And it's interesting here that Hester Prynne, as she unfolds in the novel, is very much associated with wildness. Her cottage is off on the edge of town, on the edge of the wilderness. She walks in the forest and by the sea. She proposes an escape across the sea or into the wilderness. The Puritans, as portrayed in this book, have reduced man below the human, and there's a lot of carefully chosen imagery in the opening scenes that suggest this imagery of inanimate nature, for instance. There's a rigid aspect that these men have, a grim rigidity which petrifies their faces, and the word petrifies, of course, has reference to stone. It actually comes from the Latin word for stone. They're referred to as iron men. Their whole framework is referred to as an iron framework of reasoning. The prison has an iron clamped oaken door, and the scaffold is a contrivance of wood and iron. Thus the desire of these Puritans for a kind of absolute order in society has led to a kind of leveling of society down to a kind of base physical law. It's close to the inorganic atomism of stone and metal and dead wood. Of course, there are signs of weakness in the system, weakness which we, as knowledgeable in the history of the Puritan movement, will come to recognize as weaknesses that will lead to the breakdown. Symbolically, these weaknesses are conveyed in the novel with the rose bush, which persists by the prison door, and it's noted that this had perhaps sprung up from Anne Hutchison, of course, one of the great female symbols of freedom, of feminine freedom in that period. And of course, her, at the time this novel opens, she would only have been in exile for 3 or 4 years. And of course, Anne Hutchison was kind of, in a way, a kind of foundress of a new sect. The growth of the flowers, like the growth of new ideas and ideals, cannot be suppressed. Meanwhile, the dominant image of the flower in the story seems to be of a black flower, suggesting sin and evil. But in the midst of this, Hester Prynne represents a kind of rising individuality. Puritan society is community-oriented, and it cannot really tolerate individualism. Note the way the people are portrayed as faceless masks. There's really an essential lack of individuality apparent all through this society. And Hester Prynne represents that rising spirit of individualism. She is, I suppose, the flowering rose in the middle of a dark garden. Hawthorne, I think, wants to suggest that religion, which once had a moral purpose, has weakened here almost to the point of irreligion. The focus on sin has become a kind of morbid fascination in this society with guilt. The spirit of rooting out sin and evil finds its logical extreme in Chillingsworth, who is guilty of violating the human heart. And Hawthorne seems to say that Puritanism as a whole is guilty of that sin. And of course, the morality that is offered is a very incomplete one. Notice, for instance, how the Puritans, while they are fascinated with sin and guilt and want to punish Hester Prynne for this, at the same time they have a very uneven morality. They have a great deal of license, for instance, towards the sailors in town, who are pirates, crooks, and murderers. So we have here a kind of indictment, I think, of Puritanism. The extremities of Puritan law and order, the intolerance in this society for any kind of human feeling, and the excesses of punishment. The dangers here are a violation of the human heart and the psychological stress that this society creates. And we have a great example of that in the book, of course, because it's precisely that that in the end kills off Dimmesdale. And the transforming power of this kind of excess can lead to someone like Chillingworth, who is a kind of twisted devil in his own way. And there's a reductiveness here that Hawthorne wants to point out in the Puritan way of looking at things. The phrasing in these opening scenes is worth noting. For instance, in a new colony, whatever utopia it is may be created, we find in the first couple of pages, it is necessary to construct a cemetery and a prison. And the scaffold is seen as the very ideal of ignominy. An interesting word, that ideal. And of course, the heavy irony that a utopia should need a cemetery and a prison is something that Hawthorne wants to play on. Iniquity in this society is searched out and punished in our godly New England, Hawthorne says. And the Puritan children play, but what do they play at? They play at going to church, scourging Quakers, taking Indian scalps, scaring one another with freaks of imitative witchcraft. So all in all, it seems to me there is a lot being said here about the Puritans in Hawthorne's portrayal, not only through imagery, but through subtle detail running through the book. Hawthorne seems to say that Puritanism involves a kind of psychological disease. Witchcraft, I think, in this romance must be understood as a creation of Puritanism. The bursting forth of, in some individuals, of visions, forest encounters, precisely because the Puritans have suppressed the whole emotional and feeling side of life. Witchcraft is thus a projection of Puritan fears about evil and sin and the passionate side of life, and witches are thus scapegoats. They bear the burden of Puritan guilt. Of course, we may not have needed Hawthorne's romance to suggest this. Just a careful look, as we've done earlier in this course, at the nature of witchcraft and some of the suppressions that led to it would lead us to similar conclusions. Of course, the things that stand out as startling to us, but they were clearly startling to Hawthorne too, writing in 1850, is the emphasis in this religion and in this society on whipping, on tortured introspection, on all-night vigils. The doctrine of total depravity, if we've understood it correctly, essentially puts self-help out of reach. Remember that because of the doctrine of total depravity, all efforts of the individual to save himself or herself are necessarily depraved efforts. So one cannot help oneself in this particular theological framework. At the same time, Puritanism inspires a kind of self-determination to root out evil, and it inspires a kind of hatred of self. In extremity, this becomes a kind of masochism, leading to flagellation, the bloody scourge. And Hawthorne has portrayed this so well, it seems to me, in Dimmesdale, who, of course, is driven to this by Chillingworth. Note that Dimmesdale smiles bitterly to himself when he's going through this self-flagellation. Innately and instinctively, he sees that this bind is a self-imposed one, that he cannot get out of it. But in the twisted logic of total depravity, your belief that you can get out is just one more sin of depravity. So you must keep on with the whipping. It solves and can solve nothing, but at the same time, you can't really let it go. It's too bad that we don't have more images from the Puritan era, lacking the camera, but the few we do have are of these dark wooden houses. These are houses that have survived into our own time with careful maintenance. Steep-roofed with dark siding. The tendency to paint houses today with white or pastel colors, of course, was not something that was happening in 1642. The use of tints and pigments in Puritan society did not really come into being until 20 or 30 years into the community, and so these buildings made out of strips of siding and so on, sealed up at joints, were simply left to weather in the fashion of barn board. If you've traveled through the country, you know how old barns are gray. That gray color is not exterior latex paint. That's just natural weathering, the product of rain and sun. And so these houses, and here you can see they've got cedar shakes on them too. These houses were just naturally weathered. But they do, because of that grayness, they do convey something of the sort of drab quality of this society. And thus, if you pay attention carefully to the description of Hester and Pearl, you sense that they are incredibly colorful in contrast to this. Now, not all of the artwork connected with the Scarlet Letter portrays that. There's an old line drawing, for instance, from an edition of the Scarlet Letter that shows Hester with the scarlet A on her bodice and holding Pearl before the Puritans. But even here, you can see with the sort of decorations on her dress that she comes off looking a good bit better than the sort of drab citizens who stand around and watch this particular scene. Now we need to look at the overall structure of the Scarlet Letter. And the novel has a kind of symmetry to it. It divides. Chapter 24 here isn't listed on this summary because it sort of jumps into the future. But if you keep in mind that there are a total of 24 chapters, you'll see that the novel breaks very nicely into two halves of 12 chapters each. And then those 12 chapters break into patterns of about 8 chapters followed by 4. Now there's a kind of rigorous structure here. I've indicated in very shortened form in terms of who acts in each section. But what this suggests is that in the course of the unfolding of this story, it's not only that the community acts in the first 8 chapters, but added to that, we need to say the community is the only unit, shall we say, that can act. All other units in the story or all other characters in the story are virtually powerless to act in those chapters. And what happens then is that the community virtually does all it can in those 8 chapters to act, and when its power to act is over and can go no further, then the plot changes and a new force or a new character, in this case it's Chillingworth, takes over and becomes the principal actor. And virtually everyone else is powerless to act, and Chillingworth gets his time. When he has done all he can, which more or less happens by the end of chapter 12, then it's Hester's turn. So that we see the story sort of rotating through these characters, giving each an opportunity to be the principal actor in the story. And this is, I say, with an 8-4-8-4 breakdown of chapters, and of course the novel dividing at chapter 12 into 2 halves with a climactic scene at the end of chapter 12 gives the novel a very rigorous sort of symmetry and structure. Now let's look a little more closely at how this works. In chapters 1 to 8, the community is responsible for the action. No single character can create or recreate the social situation here. Hester is guilty. She is caught. She is unable to decide her own fate or the fate of her baby. She simply assumes, of course, that she will keep her baby. Dimmesdale is guilty. He is trapped, of course, by his religious office into inaction. He sees no particular reason to confess. And Chillingworth is a recent arrival to the community, Hester's former husband, or present husband, and he is also powerless to act in any meaningful way. The only power there is for action then is the community, which of course ironically tries to stop the spread of sin, but this fails through the book. Sin, in fact, digs down deeper and burrows. The sin that the community is trying to force from a confession from Hester turns out to be a deep-rooted sin that in Dimmesdale and in Chillingworth will become more frightening and terrorizing and more pervasive in this community than this community ever imagined it could be. When we get to the end of chapter 8, with this community action, we see that the community has pretty well done all it can now with Hester. And at the end of chapter 8, the community, really it's Reverend Wilson, effectively closes the case of Boston against Hester Prynne, and Reverend Wilson leaves Providence to reveal more about what really went on or what has really gone on in this case. And this passes the case over to Chillingworth, who takes over as the principal actor then in chapters 9 to 12. He has vowed, as we know from earlier in the story, to discover Pearl's father, and he is excited by what he calls a philosopher's search, a search for truth. And in a twisted, perverted way, this is a romantic feature. If you recall the search for absolute truth that we saw in Poe, in some of Poe's stories, here it is coming out in Hawthorne's romance, but it's coming out in a very perverse sort of way. His philosopher's search is not a search for ultimate truth, something of a kind of Platonic exaltation. It is rather the search for a very deep-lying guilt or sin. Chillingworth acts in these chapters principally in terms of frequent consultations with his patient. He is living with Dimmesdale, and he probes and creates a consciousness of sin. And of course, he is the one, as I've indicated, who precipitates Dimmesdale's flagellation, his fasts, and at his vigils. And of course, the main vigil comes at the end of chapter 12. A very important scene called the minister's vigil. Chillingworth's actions drive the minister pretty well as far as he can go. And in chapter 12, in the minister's vigil, Dimmesdale is confronted with choices, and they are nicely symbolized in three different characters. One is Governor Bellingham, who represents earthly society and earthly values, and Dimmesdale makes no move to end his isolation in these terms. Mistress Hibbins represents the hellish, and this, by the way, is the same Mistress Hibbins that we saw in Young Goodman Brown, and of course she's a historical character who was tried for witchcraft. Dimmesdale does not join up with the powers of evil in the form of Mistress Hibbins, though she does invite him. And finally, Father Wilson represents heavenly society, the possibility of salvation, I suppose, for Dimmesdale, but Dimmesdale makes no confession. he comes close to speaking, but he really makes no confession in this important chapter 12. The sequence of events in chapter 12 is interesting. First, Hester and Pearl join Dimmesdale on the scaffold. This is late at night, midnight, and join hands, and he feels a kind of rush of life, a kind of bond of humanity. But when he is invited then to join them the next day at noon, publicly, he turns it down. Then there is the flash of a meteor in the sky, a kind of supernatural event. And Hawthorne goes on in that section to comment on the importance of those kinds of events in the sky, supernatural events, to accompanying important historical events. We remember, for instance, in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, for instance, there's strange storms and so on accompanying the, foretelling the death and accompanying the death. And this is often the case in early drama because the universe is supposed to be in sympathy with its tragic heroes. Of course, there's a terrible irony here that Dimmesdale's guilt and sin might be accompanied with strange astronomical events. But of course, the problem is that he sees the universe in egotistical terms. If you read that passage carefully in chapter 12, you'll realize that when supernatural events of this kind occur, it's always attached, it seems to be attached to the perception of the person who sees them. These events are not necessarily seen by everyone. They seem to be only seen by certain people. And the fact that they are seen by Dimmesdale it's suggested that this is a kind of extension of his egotism over the whole expanse of nature. He's projected his own psychological state into the sky. Then Chillingworth appears, and by now Dimmesdale ought to recognize evil. After all, Chillingworth has been working on him through these 4 chapters, and surely Dimmesdale should recognize this, but he fails to and obediently follows Chillingworth home. And then the next morning, the sexton confronts him. This is Sunday morning, and this is after his own tremendous sermon that he preaches, full of heavenly influences. Surely this should bring the minister to the point of confession. Instead, it brings denial. When the sexton mentions the strange events in the sky the night before, Dimmesdale says of the scarlet A in the sky, "No, I did not see it." And we can say then, in summary on those 4 chapters, chapters 9 to 12, that Chillingworth, his attempts to force Dimmesdale to a decision, a confessional decision, have failed. His power to act is exhausted. The minister at the end of chapter 12 has not confessed. And so then we turn to this 3rd section of the book where Hester has the principal power of action. And in this section, Hester emerges as a woman of freedom. Now wearing her former sinfulness openly, admitting it, gives her freedom from guilt. Dimmesdale is not free. A lot of his energy is consumed not from guilt, but from secret guilt, from the attempt to keep the secret hidden. And his energy is consumed with concealment and with the fear of discovery. And here Hawthorne seems to be saying something about psychology, that the Puritan system in its emphasis on guilt and sin, where it drove the awareness of sin and guilt into this kind of secrecy, actually produced deep psychological problems. And Hawthorne perhaps wasn't aware of the research that we have available now, but this is precisely right. We do know that there was a good deal of psychological stress in Puritan society. Guilt, Hawthorne seems to say, reduces people, but on the other hand, if that guilt is revealed, as it is in Hester's Scarlet A, people may become free. And guilt is thus capable of being transformed into a new power. And this is a very, very important concept to grasp, because it is also central to understanding Hawthorne himself as a guilty man who was able to transform his guilt into something else. We'll come to this when we get to the custom house. In terms of Hester, again in this section of the book, her power to act, the A here starts to shift away from an A for adultery and moves towards an A for ableness, or maybe ability, maybe even action. And she certainly takes on a power to act, because now that her sin is made public, she is relieved of the whole energy of suppression and concealment, and can go about her life. Paradoxically, the Puritans, in putting her in a position of displaying her guilt in this way, have actually liberated her for something better. Pearl, of course, emerges too as a symbol of freedom. She's always very wild and free, and she symbolizes freedom in that she has sprung from the guilty association of Hester and her father. And just to emphasize this in terms of irony, Hawthorne has made the connection between Pearl and the biblical pearl of great price. What are Hester's specific actions in this section? Well, she wins freedom from the vow of secrecy from Chillingworth in chapter 14. And then 3 chapters later, in 17, she reveals Chillingworth's identity to Dimmesdale. And then she wins Dimmesdale's forgiveness. Now, forgiveness here must stand, it seems to me, must stand symbolic of the forgiveness which the Puritan leaders of the community were unable to give. Dimmesdale, as a minister, has the power to forgive, though, of course, in Puritan thought, no forgiveness was possible from a mortal to another mortal. Forgiveness could only come from God himself. And here we probably have Hawthorne suggesting that this is the sort of shift that is necessary. The only way out of this tangle of an absolute God and a totally depraved man, and forgiveness coming only from God, the only way out of this tangle is probably for some new idea of forgiveness, so that human beings can also forgive one another. This, Hawthorne seems to say, is the way that religion must go if it is to be productive at all. Finally, Hester makes a suggestion in this section. She lays out a possibility that has never occurred never occurs in a fully Puritan theology, that is escape. Nicely captured in her words to Dimmesdale up in the forest scene, "Is the world then so narrow?" They're up in a forest, and they can look down and see Boston like a little smudge on the earth. so small, in fact, that figuratively you could put out your thumb and cover the picture of the city down in the valley. That's, of course, just a trick of viewpoint, but it's a symbolic trick of viewpoint. One is bound to a community of that kind only as long as one allows oneself to be bound. Puritan theology, of course, binds people into its community, but Hester sees that the iron laws of Puritanism only apply within a community and for those people who choose to remain with it. If you simply walk, simply escape, you are no longer bound. And this is simply not a possibility that Puritan theology, or for that matter, any theological system can really comprehend. Typically, the answer for those who walk out of the system is that they're excommunicated. An action, of course, that means something to those who remain in the community, but means virtually nothing to the person who's already decided to escape. Her actions, her visions, thus, spring from a kind of freedom that no one else in the community has, and which Dimmesdale apprehends or sees, and it does result in a kind of regeneration of Dimmesdale in that very important scene. Now, we move then to come back to our outline here. We move then from that scene to the final section in chapters 20 to 23, and here Hester has done all that she can. She has achieved her freedom. She's broken the vow with Chillingworth. She has revealed his identity. She's given Dimmesdale all the information that he needs to know, and she has proposed a way out of the dilemma of guilt and sin, and that is to escape. And at the end of that scene, she has more or less thrown the ball to him, and it is now up to him to make a decision. And of course, these last 4 chapters put the ball in Dimmesdale's court, and her power of action is over his begins. Dimmesdale's actions, however, are not successful. He reaches the greatest power and success as a minister in his final sermon in chapter 21, and it is clearly a miracle of spiritual inspiration. Hawthorne even suggests that the Spirit is descending upon him. There's an irony here, if you think about it, a theological irony of a very high order. Dimmesdale can't confess. He is convinced of his sin and guilt, and that paralyzes him. Meanwhile, he preaches a sermon in which he is inspired, not making the crucial connection that God is the source of the inspiration as well as his feeling of sin and guilt. In failing to recognize that, he fails to realize that salvation is there, that he is actually receiving grace through a kind of inspiration in his preaching. But he doesn't see that. He separates what's happening to him in terms of inspiration from what's happening to him in terms of guilt, and never connects the two. His final act comes in chapter 23, the revelation of the Scarlet Letter, when he bears his breast. But of course, it is at this point too late, and his act of penance comes really too late. Now, the novel has a kind of rhythm to it. It oscillates on the one hand between a kind of imprisonment that is represented by the Puritan society at one level, and a possible freedom, that kind of liberation from this that the novel looks forward to. The the liberation from this bondage of Puritanism is not simply a matter of a physical liberation. Being let out of prison, having one's physical freedom is not full freedom. Not in this society. Just going loose, being out from behind bars is not enough. What has to occur is the achievement of some kind of spiritual freedom. And Puritan society does not allow for that kind of spiritual freedom. Some other kind of freedom must be carved out. And Hester's life seems to be a kind of carving out of a new kind of freedom. First of all, she breaks out of the Puritan system by setting aside its whole system of guilt. Here, paradoxically, the Puritan community is responsible for her liberation. By forcing her to wear the badge of her sin, make it public, they allow her to achieve something better. Dimmesdale has bad moments his whole life. Every day he faces a very bad moment all over again, the concealment of his sin. Hester, on the other hand, has one very, very bad moment, the moment she is released from prison and is forced to stand for 2 hours. And by the way, this was a standard kind of punishment in Puritan society. She's forced to stand for a couple of hours, displayed for the whole community. Once she steps off that scaffold, even though she wears that scarlet A, the worst moment for her is behind her. And now, as time passes, people become more and more familiar with the A. She's able to get on with her life. And in a matter of 6 or 7 years, she is able to put the whole guilt associated with that A behind her. And she does that, in a sense, by transforming the meaning of that scarlet A. She embroiders it, for instance. She makes it not a badge of sin, but a badge of pride in her workmanship. One could say she transforms it from a sign of adultery to a sign of art. Certainly into something that represents a sign of her ability. She becomes a sought-after seamstress in the community. And thus, she slowly transforms physical freedom into freedom of movement and freedom of speech and freedom of activity, freedom of influence, and eventually, through this long process of setting guilt behind, she is able to liberate herself from it. Now, there's a fascinating thing going on here. When you define Scarlet, when you define the Scarlet Letter in this fashion and you define Hester Prynne in this fashion, you recognize that Hester is not a 17th century woman. Even if you take the best statements that Anne Bradstreet made in her poetry, for instance, or that Anne Hutchinson achieved in her liberation from this Puritan community, Hester accomplishes far more, and she doesn't appear to be a 17th century woman. And I would propose that really she is Hawthorne's creation of a 19th century woman. If we keep in mind that the story is placed in the period from 1642 to 1649, and Hawthorne is writing this story exactly 2 centuries later in 1849, published in 1850, we can see that there is a disjunction in time here. The Puritan community that is a backdrop for the story is 17th century. The woman who carves out her freedom, it seems to me, is very much a 19th century woman. A woman whose idea of God, of spirit, of love, of community is very different, who doesn't seem to be caught in the web of guilt. And I mean, she doesn't show any signs of guilt like Dimmesdale does. She doesn't go through flagellation. She doesn't go through isolation. She gets right down to business and transforms her life into something different, into an artistic life. I mean, her sewing, her decoration of the heart, her even dressing up her little girl to look like a Scarlet A, seems to be a transformation of a dull, drab life in Puritan New England into something bright and colorful and creative and artistic. And when we keep in mind that the Puritans were so negative about art, remember they had closed the theaters back in 1644 in Europe. They lobbied against all kinds of dramatic productions in Puritan New England. They, in a sense, forced their poets underground. We can see then, I think, that that Hester is a 19th century artist in the middle of a 17th century society, transforming it in her own person and in her own lifestyle. Well, now that brings us to this very important introduction to the Scarlet Letter, the Custom House. Biographically, Hawthorne had spent 3 years at Concord, we'll recall in the Old Manse, from 1842 to 45. A little before that, he'd spent 6 months at Brook Farm. Money ran out. He and his new bride, Sophia, really were pretty poor in Concord. And so after 3 years of trying to make money on his writing, they realized he needed some kind of employment. And he got a political appointment and moved into the Custom House, went back to Salem and moved into the Custom House as one of the officials there. And this was not a productive period in his life. And the Custom House story is, or prelude is really about those 3 years that he spent. The Custom House is a kind of romancer's device. Even though he's written a romance that seems very separated from anything we'd find in real life, he covers it in the Custom House by saying, in effect, believe it or not, there is evidence for the story which follows. And I'm going to tell you what the evidence is. And of course that has to do with the finding of the Scarlet Letter in the Custom House up in the attic among the old papers. The Custom House opening paragraphs establish an autobiographical framework, though he says, Hawthorne says that he's going to keep the inmost me behind a veil. In other words, this autobiography will not be an embarrassing confession on his part. His romance will be, in effect, his confession, the romance which follows. And that's important to understand, that the romance is a kind of transmuted confession. Then he describes the setting of this near the beginning. He describes the Custom House, and a very accurate description it is. In my native town of Salem, at the head of what half a century ago was a bustling wharf, stands a spacious edifice of brick. A civil, not a military post of Uncle Sam's government. Its front is ornamented with a portico of half a dozen wooden pillars supporting a balcony, beneath which a flight of wide granite steps descends towards the street. Over the entrance hovers an enormous specimen of the American eagle with outspread wings, a shield before her breast, and if I recollect aright, a bunch of intermingled arrows in each claw. With the customary infirmity of temper, she appears to warn all citizens against intruding on the premises, which she overshadows with her wings. From this description of the custom house, he then moves into one of the crucial elements of this account, and that is his ancestry. Hawthorne's ancestral roots are in Salem, where he is a member of this official group at the custom house. His ancestors go back to Puritan times. And he talks about these ancestors. The first one he describes as sable-cloaked and steeple-crowned. This was William Hawthorne, spelt like Hawthorne, but remove the W. Remember, Hawthorne added the W to his name, but the family name was Hawthorne. William Hawthorne, 1607 to 1681 are his dates. He was the first Puritan member of the family. He is described in here as a soldier, legislator, a judge, and a bitter prosecutor. And his severity towards a Quaker woman is noted in the text. His son, John Hawthorne, dates 1641 to 1717, was one of the persecutors of the witches at Salem. And it should be fairly clear here that Hawthorne feels himself implicated in guilt. As a descendant of someone who prosecuted witches, Hawthorne feels very, very guilty. But notice how he deals with this. He says, at all events, I, the present writer, hereby take shame upon myself for their sakes, and pray that any curse incurred by them, as I have heard, and as the dreary and unprosperous condition of the race for many a long year back would argue to exist, may be now and henceforth removed. So Hawthorne is taking upon himself this guilt. This is racial guilt. This is group guilt. It's the sin of the fathers descending upon the sons. And if you're reading carefully, you might here begin to sense that the Custom House is not just a preface to the novel with a bit of anecdotal autobiography. Hawthorne feels he is implicated in guilt and shame for his Puritan ancestors. And somehow that is the reason for his preface. And if we recognize then that the story of Hester Prynne is a story about guilt and shame, and the author feels guilt and shame over his own ancestors being involved in these questionable activities, we should be able to sense that there is a profound relationship here between Hawthorne and Hester Prynne. That somehow her story is a transformed version of Hawthorne's story. Hester, after all, works her way out of guilt and sin. And I think it's obvious that Hawthorne, too, is writing this story in order to clear himself from guilt and sin. What he seems to be doing is, in essence, using this guilt and sin of his own family as a kind of inspirational power that he can move beyond. In other words, in the same way that Hester utilized her guilt and her sin and the badge of her adultery as the touchstone for her art, Hawthorne II is using his own sin and guilt as the beginning point for a transformation of sin and guilt into his art. Now, there's a very long description in here, and most students reading it get feeling really bogged down. I refer to pages 2183 to 2192. The description of the various characters in the custom house, the inspector, the collector, and so on. And most readers find that they really can't relate to this section. It just seems to go on tediously. I think the main point is here that the men of the custom house are men of no creativity whatever. They are effectively dead, imaginatively dead. It's not their fault, of course, but you'll notice that Hawthorne finds himself, while he's in the custom house, slipping into precisely this same sort of mode, a kind of spiritual deadness. But then things all of a sudden come to life, and he makes his crucial discovery. This is on pages 2192 to 95, and that is his discovery of the Scarlet Letter, a little packet that he unfolds, and he discovers this old Scarlet Letter, an A, each side measuring precisely 3¼ inches, dilapidated with most of the gold embroidery worn away, but clearly it was a very beautiful sort of thing. Now, I think we have to recognize from the outset that this is a fictional account. There's no other evidence that that Scarlet A actually survives or survived, that Hawthorne actually found a Scarlet A. It wasn't among his effects or among his personal belongings. It wasn't deposited in any museum. No one else saw it. So this would appear to be a fictional account. Though we must also acknowledge that a law was passed later in the 17th century which called for precisely the punishment that Hester Prynne gets, and that is for being displayed in public with just such a letter sewn on one's clothing. So we're faced with a dilemma here. We have to admit the possibility that Hawthorne could have found such a letter. This is not something that is entirely impossible, but the evidence would suggest that this is a fictional event. But what is less important, what is really more important than whether or not Hawthorne found such a little cloth letter, what is more important is what happens to him in the custom house and what happens to him as he tries to take these old records that he's looking at in the custom house and transform them into art. If we don't have an exact autobiography here of Hawthorne, perhaps we can see that what we have is an autobiography of romance itself. And we see him going through a process with this letter, with this old document. We see him going through an imaginative and emotional process as he tries to contemplate this A, as he holds it up to his breast and feels the heat from it. And something inside him begins to germinate. Remember, he's been 3 years in this terrible environment with these custom house officials which are imaginatively dead. And he has become imaginatively dead himself. And historically, that's true. Hawthorne didn't write, he wrote virtually nothing during those years. And now, with this letter, we can actually see the process of him coming imaginatively to life. And Hawthorne's captured that for us. Maybe he didn't find an A, but we do know that he rummaged through old records, that he read old newspapers, that he was constantly examining history for inspiration. And if the A doesn't necessarily, wasn't a literal discovery, it may be a kind of symbolic discovery for antiquities or archival materials or something, which in themselves then get transformed into the art of his writings. Now, keep in mind, if you read this in the normal order, you read the Custom House before you read the Scarlet Letter, so you really don't know what the A stands for. If you're reading this for the very first time, you don't know what the A, everybody who's read the Scarlet Letter knows what it stands for after they've read it, but the first time, you really don't know what the A stands for. So here you find Hawthorne finding this Scarlet A, and we know that he feels guilty, and we know that he puts it up to his breast, and he feels this heat. And then he talks about a story coming forward, and the A seems to stand in the context of Hawthorne, seems to stand for something like art. And why would Hawthorne feel guilty? Well, we know he feels guilty about his ancestors being involved in the witchcraft trials, but why else? Well, he's an artist. He's a writer. That's not something in the Puritan context that was anything to be proud about. At one point he says they would just think of me as a storyteller. That's not a very important function. Hawthorne seems to feel guilty about writing romances. He, especially because his romances and many of his stories that we've seen in the early tales grow out of Puritan guilt. His own hang-up, you see, is his guilt over his family. And yet, what has he done? Over and over again, he's written stories like Young Goodman Brown and The Minister's Black Veil and numerous others which exploit Puritan guilt and sin. And Hawthorne, rather than accepting it as a belief system, he has transformed it into an artistic product. And he feels guilty about that. Well, what he's saying, I think, is that his romances, in a somewhat similar way to Poe's romances, which grow out of obsession and murder and death and so on, Hawthorne is confessing here that his romances grow out of guilt, sin, and suffering, and the evil of probing into the lives of people and violations of the human heart. Now, we need to look at these important passages in which he defines what happens in the creative process. What a romancer does is something like look at an ordinary scene in the moonlight. Here's a passage, one of the passages that I'm referring to. Moonlight in a familiar room, falling so white upon the carpet, and showing all its figures so distinctly, making every object so minutely visible, yet so unlike a morning or noontide visibility, is a medium the most suitable for a romance writer to get acquainted with his elusive guests. Details so completely seen are so spiritualized that they seem to lose their actual substance and become things of the intellect. If you could try to imagine, recall, let's say a moonlit room at night, no light in it, just the moon coming in the window, that sort of preternatural feeling that you get at the scene is what the romancer tries to create. He goes on, thus, therefore, the floor of our familiar room has become a neutral territory, somewhere between the real world and fairyland, where the actual and the imaginary may meet, and each imbue itself with the nature of the other. But it's so, I mean, here's a moonlit scene to get that sort of preternatural quality that we're referring to. Of course, this is a painting from the Romantic era of the Hudson River School of this same period. The romancer tries to capture not an ordinary scene, but the scene transmuted by moonlight. The coal fire does the same sort of thing. The somewhat dim coal fire has an essential influence. It throws its tinge throughout the room with a faint ruddiness upon the walls and ceiling, and a reflected gleam from the polish of the furniture. This warmer light mingles itself with the cold spirituality of the moonbeams and communicates a heart and sensibilities of human tenderness to the forms fancy summons up. So what we have then, what we have Hawthorne doing is saying that a romance bears the same relationship to real life as a moonlit scene or a firelit scene bears to the same scene under the full light of day. The romancer tries to cast a kind of moonlight or firelight over the scene, and in so doing spiritualizes that scene and transmutes it into something else. This is the essence of romance. It's an analogy. Moonlight and firelight is a kind of analogy of what the romancer does, but it's a kind of spiritualizing of the real world. Now, Hawthorne did this time and time again. Here, for instance, is the real house in New England. Survives to today. This is the house that gives rise to the House of the Seven Gables. We can only see some of them there. And in this schematic drawing, that's actually the same house, just turned at a different angle. But Hawthorne constantly wanted to change real things into something that had a kind of spiritual quality with a different lighting about it, and ordinary things become symbolic. He did the same thing with the great Donatello sculpture of the marble faun. Turned this great sculpture into something that was transmuted and symbolic in his novel. And always we need to keep in mind that what Hawthorne is doing is something like casting an ordinary scene in a different light. Now, we've talked about American Romanticism under these three headings. These are familiar. And we've talked extensively about the first two in connection with Hawthorne in an earlier class. What we haven't talked about is the philosophy of Romanticism in terms of Hawthorne. Here are perhaps the main points for discussing a philosophy of Romanticism. We've seen idealism in the physical world, particularly in Poe, under the headings of beauty, truth, and knowledge. You need to go back to earlier screens in the second Emerson lecture to see the full working out of this. We've seen idealism in the spiritual world, and we've seen Emerson's theory of symbolism from his essay Nature. What Hawthorne adds to this is idealism in art. And we can expand that in these terms, that idealism in art equals romance. Art is the real world transformed, and we have examples of the Puritan world transformed in the Scarlet Letter and the House of the Seven Gables. And we have Brook Farm transformed in the Blithedale romance. We have also, under idealism in art, we have a symbolic presentation to reveal the spiritual, moral, or artistic meaning of things. In the same way that Emerson wants to reveal a spiritual meaning of nature, Hawthorne wants to reveal an artistic meaning. And he does this through symbols of evil, such as the prison or the scaffold, or the A standing for adultery. He also does it with symbols of good, such as flowers, the pearl, and the A transformed into Abel or art or angel. Thirdly, artistic creation is seen as a spiritual activity, the conversion of a dead past to a living story, as in the Custom House, or the transcendence of the ordinary and the common into something extraordinary and uncommon. And this takes place at many different levels. It takes place in the artist, in Hawthorne himself, as he feels inspired in the Custom House by the Scarlet A. It takes place in the character Hester Prynne, who escapes from bondage to freedom and becomes transcendent. It takes place in things, the Scarlet A moving from adultery to art to angel. And it takes place in events, such as the meteor in the Scarlet Letter in that crucial chapter 12.